Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. This podcast is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox, a new online collection of practical, trusted resources made for those who support global missions from home. Visit us online at globalmissionstoolbox.com to register for access to this growing collection of tools for senders. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Global Missions Podcast. Hi, Maddie.
Hello, and hello to all our listeners. It is good to be here again.
Today, we will have another interview with Jonathan Trotter. And before we get going, we wanted to mention that he and his wife, Elizabeth, they contribute together to a blog entitled A Life Overseas. And that blog has an accompanying Facebook page. And Jonathan posted on that Facebook page about today's conversation, and he actually asked their audience about our topic today in advance as well.
Yes, so our topic is about how to talk to missionaries, and Jonathan got lots of responses to this Facebook post asking what missionaries would say in regard to that topic, and their responses are both funny and otherwise. So if Facebook is your thing and these topics are interesting to you, you could go find A Life Overseas on Facebook and even find their post about our episode today.
Well, whether Facebook is your thing or not, Maddie, you and I have been spending a lot more time on Facebook recently, right?
That is true. I've always said that really the main reason I like Facebook is for Marketplace and for groups. And that has held true because we are using a Facebook group for the Global Missions Toolbox online community.
Well, it's really new to us. And as we were recording this, we're in the first week after the launch, and we are really encouraged to see people join this community and looking forward to learning from each other in this way. And Maddie, if I can just add, one of the reasons why I'm so excited about this is I love the podcast, but it's a one-way presentation. It's like a broadcast, right? Mm-hmm. What I love is that we're starting to have a two-way dialogue and having feedback and conversation really through that online community. So I'm pretty amped about this.
Definitely. It's very exciting. And we are really anticipating what this community could become and praying that God would use it to unite believers as they serve Him.
Well, you know also that we keep show notes if you've listened before, so you can find the link to the Facebook page in the show notes for this episode at globalmissionspodcast.com, and you are most welcome to inquire about joining the community there.
You got it. Now let's jump into today's conversation with Jonathan.
Our guest today is Jonathan Trotter, the co-author of the book Serving Well, Help for the Wannabe, Newbie, or Weary Cross-Cultural Christian Worker. Jonathan served in Cambodia for 8 years, after which he relocated back to the United States, where he now provides online pastoral care and coaching to global workers through Seeing the Hearts of the Hurting and Team Expansion. We will keep show notes for this episode. I'll just say that now, as Jonathan mentions a few things along the way, including some of the links if you'd like to reach out to Jonathan afterwards as well. He and his wife Elizabeth and their 4 kids served as a youth pastor in the Midwest before he went overseas. And I saw Jonathan also served in an inner city ER and trauma center as a nurse and trained as an attorney. You've done a lot of things in your time.
I feel like I just had all my midlife crises early. Yes.
Okay.
Oh, here we are.
Well, it's a very rich experience, and we're going to hear how Jonathan is well positioned. He's got credentials and credibility for this topic. This is our second conversation with Jonathan on the program. We'll include a link back to episode 128, which we called 5 Things Everyone Should Understand About Missionaries. Jonathan, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Appreciate the invite.
Well, glad to unpack this topic with you today. We've entitled it, How to Talk to Missionaries, which may imply that they're a very special group of people and we need a special talent or awareness. And I'm looking forward to enriching these ideas. Before we get to unpacking the topic, though, just tell us a bit about what your day-to-day looks like now as you connect with God's mission workers.
Sure. I do connect with a lot of cross-cultural folks day to day. The title of this does make me think of that old book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. I
Right.
think we add like missionaries are from Pluto. I don't know
Yeah.
how to talk to them. So my day-to-day job then is tuning in via Zoom primarily with folks all over the world and just
Mm.
walking alongside of them. So call it pastoral care and empathetic coaching as they walk through mission problems and issues or just human life stuff, marriage, children, grief, loss, transition,
Sure.
all of that.
Well, I appreciate the way you're leveraging the technology too. It's one blessing that some of the last couple of years has brought to us is our readiness to use technology for things that might formerly have been waiting for
Absolutely.
more attention. And now you can do it on a day-to-day, week-to-week
That's
basis.
right.
So today we are going to talk about how to talk, in this case with mission workers, and we hope that this will provide you, our listeners, with some ideas to help you communicate really in sensitive and effective ways with missionaries in a way that the missionaries would appreciate. They may be helpful to you as you speak to folks who are visiting at your church, and they may be on furlough or on home service, whatever you might call it at your church. Or if you get to reach out to them online, as we just said with Jonathan, there are new ways to be in touch with our mission workers. Because Jonathan is in that space, he's ready to really be helpful on this. Jonathan, before we started recording, we already talked a little bit about this. I know you want to root our conversation in a particular biblical story today. So why don't you go to that story and set the stage for us?
Sure. And this story really has been super helpful for me in conceptualizing how do we walk alongside of people in their pain or just in their life. And the story in Genesis 16 of Hagar has been really helpful in providing some of that framework. And briefly, of course, Hagar has endured a bit of trauma even and is sort of sent out away. She is wandering, pregnant and alone in the wilderness, fairly despondent. And the scriptures say that the angel of the Lord, so most theologians think this is God himself showing up to Hagar. And he starts off by asking her two questions. He says, "Where have you come from and where are you going?" And those two questions, looking backwards at, hey, where have you come from? And looking ahead, where are you going? While he is with her in the moment. And of course, later, Hagar says, "This is the God who sees me." Something about his presence there left her with the impression that this was a different kind of God. This was a God who sees me. So when we're talking about listening to people, whether they're missionaries or not, and whether they're in pain or not, this concept of these two questions, where have you come from and where are you going, while always knowing I want to be with you right here in the present, has been a helpful construct for me. And I think it represents the heart of God for people all over the world.
Well, I think it's going to, like you said, it could be helpful in any conversation at all,
Yeah.
but a helpful framework. So let's start in. I'm assuming we'll go sequentially here. If
Sure.
we start with that question, where have you come from? How do you want to bring that out here?
Yeah. So, in the context of senders talking with their missionaries, this question can go a lot of different directions. But I would encourage folks to ask the obvious, where have you come from and what airports did you fly through? But on a much deeper level, we're saying, what has been your experience this term? And that is a sensitivity to the traumas, maybe the losses, the joys of what has been. Not necessarily just what have you done this term, although that's a part of where have you come from as well, sort of seeing this missionary as also a human being. I had a client once who loved the phrase highs, lows, and buffaloes. And I would love if this sort of caught on. Maybe it already has in some circles. It was new to me, but it's a simple idea of saying, hey, what was something that was a high for you?
Right.
What was something that was a low? And then what was something that was just so weird, that was just unexpected as a buffalo? Highs, lows, buffaloes. Where have you come from?
That's really good. I appreciate the highs, lows, and buffalo because it doesn't mean that it's necessarily a negative experience. When we
Right.
talk about debriefing, sometimes it leans toward that. So what was hard?
Yeah.
And that's an important part of it, but it's just an element. And we hope certainly
That's
there would
right.
be more there. Are there some examples of questions that really take us to this place? You mentioned, well, what airport did you come through? But
Sure. This is where folks can be creative if they want to, but simply saying, hey, what's something your family likes to do on a weekend? These are questions that invite the missionary to respond with their humanness, not just with their work output, and say, yeah, this term, our normal Saturday or something we love doing on Saturday was going to the mall. And we didn't do that in America, but we did that there because it was the only air conditioned place in the city. Those types of things. This posture of curiosity. Hey, what's a food that you miss when you're back here in your country, of your passport country? Who do you miss, or what are you excited to do here?
Mhm.
Those types of things. What's something you like about that region? Have you traveled around that region? Those are types of questions that are exploratory. And again, the sky's the limit on expressing this sort of posture of curiosity.
Curiosity, great word. I really appreciate that you lifted out, Jonathan, the idea that it can go beyond, it should go beyond vocation and the
Absolutely.
ministry work, right? Like, so how's the Bible study going? And did you
Yes.
preach often? And how many people responded? Whatever.
Right.
Again, important parts of it, but you're talking about engaging the whole person and their whole, instead of just the vocational ministry, right? It's got to go beyond that when we care.
Well, and you had mentioned that a lot of times we tend towards either the work product or, whoa, this must have been really hard. How have you suffered? Which is important, but the where have you come from also makes space for growth and makes space for strength. Hey, what has been exciting for you? What's been something exhilarating that you've experienced? That could be on the work side, or that could be, wow, I got invited to climb Mount Kilimanjaro with a team and I never saw myself doing that. It could be all sorts of things. And I think it's important for us to make space for the joys of life, for the beauty of cross-cultural living as well, without forcing somebody to only think about the beauty. Of course, this is going to be balanced.
Well, as people often are serving at distance and time passes, it often comes up with missionaries that there's a conversation to renew a relationship. We haven't had a chance to talk for some time, and it could be years since we've actually had an in-person conversation. Maybe somebody who's on home service or furlough, or they're back from some kind of a mission. What are some of the things we might keep in mind when we're talking to missionaries we haven't talked to for a long time?
Yeah, again, I'm going to keep saying posture of curiosity because that just goes so far. One thing that I talk often with missionaries about when they're preparing for a big transition is recognizing the difference between a movie poster and a full-length feature film. And I would hope that I'm speaking to the listeners here that we could also use this idea or this model as a framework. Basically, it's not rocket science, but it's recognizing that when missionaries come back after a while, sometimes they're not sure, is this person asking for the movie poster version of my last 4 years?
Well, that is
like,
good.
hey, how was your life? How in the world do I answer that? And so what I encourage missionaries to be aware of is to see, are they asking for the movie poster, which is just this is the 10-second for-your conversation. Are they asking for the trailer? This is like a 3-minute version. Say, I'm going to give the highlights and see if they're interested in more. Or is this person asking for, hey, let's go out to coffee. I want to hear the whole thing, the 2.5-hour version. While knowing that there are going to be a couple of people who say, I want more than the 2.5-hour version. I want the director's cut. I want the background commentary. But that's not going to be everybody. And so I think for senders, recognizing, what am I asking for? Am I asking for the movie poster in the foyer, or am I really wanting the full length thing? And you can really go a long ways with workers by letting them know, hey, I don't have time right now, but later I'd love to hear the whole thing or not. So that framework can really help a worker relax if they know that, okay, now's not the time. I'm giving the trailer at the church on Sunday morning, but there's a team of people that I'm going to have the opportunity to really share with on a deeper level. It can be super helpful.
That's really good. And if I may add to this idea that Jonathan, this is kind of the asker here. I want to just speak to the missionary side. And for those of us that work closely with missionaries, to help them prepare for something like this, realizing that people with good intentions will ask, so how was your term? And they don't show you, it's not obvious right at the beginning, which they want. So discerning that and having those versions ready. In other words, here's the poster version, here's the trailer version, here's the full length version. Being ready to kind of summarize that. Please be sensitive, dear friends, to missionaries who aren't really good at summarizing stuff, because some of us aren't, right? We just don't have it. Maybe we could be better prepared, which is a good skill. That's what I'm advocating for here. Let's help the missionaries get ready too. But just watching, they might not have figured that out yet. I love the analogy,
It's true.
Jonathan.
It's true.
It's really, really helpful.
Yeah. To the missionaries, I do encourage them to recognize, to have grace. Not everybody in the foyer knows how to ask, but if they're asking, let's be gracious. Let's give the poster version with grace. And if they express interest, let's give them more. Hopefully that grace goes both ways for the missionary who misinterprets and says, oh, these people obviously want the 2.5-hour version. And that's maybe not the case.
I'll just add this one last idea. If you're one of those people who would like to see not only the poster and the trailer and the movie, but the director's cut and all those extra bonus features that are on the DVD version extended, would you find the right way to connect with the missionaries? Because that can be a real blessing when that time comes and there's somebody that will take the time and interest. Because many of us, we can manage the trailer version and we want to hear more, but we can only manage the trailer version. If you like the long version, maybe you might serve on a missions committee at your church to love on missionaries who are home. And just to encourage, the links will be there, but you can learn from someone like Jonathan about how you can be well equipped to really love and encourage and support a missionary who would love to tell the whole story.
That's right.
Well, of course, Jonathan, we have folks serving around the world, different countries, cultures, things that we may not be familiar with here in the West. Most of our audience is in the West. Do you think missionaries appreciate questions directed toward them about what life is like overseas? Should we ask those questions or not?
I think it's fair game. And I think that it expresses, even if the question feels ignorant or you're scared of being ignorant, I think most missionaries would rather you ask it than not. And so I would encourage folks to not be afraid to look dumb. If you're expressing interest, I put this question to a group of friends who are cross-cultural workers, and one person said, yes, tell them, ask questions. What kind of bugs are there? Do you like them? Do you eat bugs? Like, ask the questions. And I think that's a general tenor I hear from workers, is that, sure, maybe it's a question that if they had read my last newsletter, they would know, but I would rather they ask it than not.
Let's set this scenario. We serve in a home church, and we know that a missionary is coming on home service or on furlough. They're going to be here in 6 months, something like that. And we'd like to be ready. How would you suggest that we prepare? How can we preload for those conversations?
With discussions with the missionary before they arrive, or just as a church or as
I meant more to be ready so that we can prepare to have the conversations, probably.
Okay. Yeah. Well, so basically, I would encourage reading the whatever newsletters have come in the last few months as a preliminary thing. I encourage missionaries to do this on stateside service too, or home assignment, is to browse the social media of the people that you're meeting with. And so a missions committee could do that as well. It's not stalking them to judge them.
Not weird. Yeah.
But to gain an awareness of, a couple months ago, it looks like they traveled, across the border for a visa run. They'd be curious to ask them how that was. So there can be sort of that, I don't know, recon is probably too strong of a word, but most cross-cultural folks are putting out information through Instagram or Facebook or newsletters. Easy preliminary thing would be to make sure that you are up to date on whatever those things are.
It's good advice. Just before we take a break, I'll ask one more question along this line of where have you come from? Where are you coming from? Are there questions that you think we should just stay away from? That you classically hear, you know what, just that's not a place you need to go.
Well, one thing that I would caution folks, missionaries often hear, aren't you glad to be home?
Right.
And That's a well-intentioned question, but it can be a very confusing question for missionary kids, but also for the adults as well, because home is becomes a fluid concept, and sometimes home, it feels like both places are home. That question just doesn't give the space to recognize that for a lot of folks, the place they live now feels a whole lot like home and actually is home. It is home. And so that's a question I think that is worth avoiding. That, hey, aren't you glad to be home? It's better to say, hey, what's something you're looking forward to here, back in your passport country? That is maybe gets to the same point, but without the confusion or sort of the weighted danger of that. I also did have a friend say it's very hurtful when folks ask questions about their marital status. So, especially for single workers. I was never single on the field. I've walked alongside of a lot, but this was from a worker who's not married and on the field.
Right.
And she said that I am more than my marital status. And so, coming back as a missionary to a church and primarily hearing, have you met anyone yet? When are you going to get married? Are you going to move back here so you can get married? Is very disturbing. I don't know if that's too strong, but that would be a question or line of questions to avoid.
It's a good word. It's a good word too. Well, some really good ideas here looking back. Where are you coming from? In a moment, Jonathan's going to share some more ideas connected to this story of Hagar that will be helpful as we connect with missionaries. Before we get to that part of our conversation, we'd like to share this tool that we hope will be helpful to you and your church.
The Missionary Friends posting, contributed by Catalyst Services, is an article emphasizing the importance of this sometimes overlooked and undervalued Great Commission role, a friend. This article describes the special role of a missionary friend and how it is distinct from others who care for and support a missionary. In today's conversation, Jonathan talked about the movie poster, movie trailer, and feature-length movie version of your life. For those of you who want the feature-length version of your missionary friend's life and experiences, you will be helped and encouraged by this tool for the family and friends of mission workers. You can find the article in our show notes or on our website, globalmissionstoolbox.com.
We are back with Jonathan Trotter, co-author together with your wife, right, Jonathan?
That's right.
Elizabeth was your co-author. That's important to mention.
And she was pretty much the editor.
Oh, okay. All right, good. So thank you to Jonathan and Elizabeth for this book, Serving Well, Help for the Wannabe, Newbie, or Weary Cross-Cultural Christian Worker. So, Jonathan, we've talked about where have you come from? What's the other part of the story that you want to use today?
Yeah, we've already looked at the looking back. So, where have you come from? And the other part, the angel of the Lord asks Hagar, well, where are you going? And in a way that's saying, what are your hopes? What are your dreams? What's the future look like for you? So, in a nutshell, that's the forward-looking part.
And well, let's just go right to some of the questions we might use. Where do you suggest we consider going?
Yeah, and I think sometimes folks will err on only looking back or only looking forward. So I just want to pause here and say these have to be balanced.
Sure.
And we say if I trend towards looking forward, maybe I'll emphasize the other side. But for here, say, where are we going? It is good to say, what are you hoping for in the next term? What are your dreams? And so that can be work related. That can also be life related. Well, in the next term, one of my kids is moving back, for university. Okay, well, it's good to know that. It's good to have some conversations around that. What are you looking forward to? That could be work related. That could be, there's going to be a conference opportunity to take this trip that's actually really exciting. What are some things you may be nervous about? And of course, how can we support you in the future moving ahead? What does that look like? What would you like for that to look like? All are very important and valuable questions.
Acknowledging that we already talked about some cautions about looking back, marital status, for example. So do you have any plans along this line?
Right.
And just the inappropriate of that. With that already said, are there any other cautions that you might have that would be different than before? Perhaps they're the same, but just wondering whether there's any flags that you would put up and say, please be really careful with this.
I think a danger would be assuming that a missionary is going to keep doing the same thing they've always been doing.
Hmm.
Recognizing that the secular literature shows people make transitions a lot. Some of them are chosen, some of them are forced. I think one danger would be assuming that the missionary is going to continue on this track forever till kingdom come. And so if you talk as if you expect the missionary to do that, they might not say a whole lot more because that's kind of an off limits conversation. But if you ask questions like, hey, are you feeling led any different directions, or what are some challenges coming down the pipe, or you at least open up the conversation, you might be surprised with what you get. And in any case, that's going to be helpful for everyone involved.
Well, there's some ideas about questions to look back, being very present and intentional right now, and looking forward. What other suggestions do you have just to help fill this out about how we can talk to missionaries in the way they appreciate?
Yeah, I mean, this comes back to just recognizing, like we joked about it at the beginning, missionaries are not from outer space.
Right.
And a friend of mine said, remind people that I am more than a missionary. In fact, he said, and he lived in the Middle East for quite a few years, and he said, 80% of my life is like yours. And I think other missionaries might disagree with that percentage, but the point holds. There are a lot of similarities. Missionaries have marriage issues. Missionaries struggle with kids, or their kids have learning challenges, or we're wrestling with ill parents who are back in our passport countries, or the future is unknown, or running out of cash, or I don't know if we are preparing well for retirement. All of those things that are very common. So I would and just encourage all of us to remember that at the core, primarily, missionaries are humans who are also loved by God, regardless of how much work they do, how much fruit they produce. That they are loved children of God, and that matters a lot.
It's really good. Really good. I haven't talked with Jonathan about this yet, but this idea of debriefing a missionary on a period of home service or furlough, Jonathan, we're very much in favor of folks having opportunities to do that. And I understand some of your work is helping with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess I want to distinguish a little here and say we think it's really important that a missionary be asked very deep, appropriate questions by the right kind of people and have a debrief that way. But not to take it onto a caring church member's plate, to take it upon themselves to go to those places necessarily. So here's my question after all that. Do you think it's appropriate to ask a missionary, have you had an opportunity to debrief your term deeply with someone?
I think that's a great question, recognizing that there's so much diversity in the relationships, and they may not feel comfortable going into all of those areas with the same people who control their finances.
Right.
And this is something that's important to remember. Most of us don't have to share our entire spiritual life, how our families are doing, struggles our children are going through with our boss. That's an unusual dynamic and actually can be fairly horrible. So it does not need to be the senders necessarily who have a right even to all of those personal questions. They can ask about the work. And of course, if they're providing the funds, then they do have a right for that. And I respect that. But missionaries are sometimes in very awkward places when they're asked to go to very deep spiritual, emotional, marital, relational places with the people who hold the checkbook. And that's just not normal. So that's one of the things I love about my job is, and I see life come back. I see peace come when I tell a new client, I don't care about your work. How are you? And again, I get to do that because I'm not responsible for their work. But we want to make sure that our missionaries have some people like that in their life. Whether they're at the church, great, that's fine. But if they're not, they need to be somewhere. So if they need to outsource that, then outsource it. And maybe the church maybe should pay for that.
Well, I appreciate just the discussion around this because I am advocating for great debriefs in the right way.
Yeah.
As Jonathan has said, if you're debriefing with the person who determines your salary, there's such a tension in that. And frankly, having been a missionary, both Jonathan and I have been missionaries, that's always kind of in the back of our mind. What about support? What about finances? Partly what I want to do is for those of you listening who may be serving on a missions committee or a pastor or can advocate for a great, safe debriefing that will really serve that missionary family with excellence and care. And it may not be exactly by their agency or by their sending church, but it might be somebody who's near alongside who can love and care for them with wisdom. There needs to be great communication in that. When red flags come up, we need to communicate rightly. We're affirming all of that. But that debriefing opportunity is really something that I want to advocate for.
Absolutely. It's so important.
Well, probably some of this, Jonathan, is just doing good communication, right? Like when you're having a conversation with someone, have a conversation with them, be present right there, right? And I mean, we in the West, we got these things called these phones that follow us around, and they're often in our hand. Just being present with people is going to be an important part of communication anytime, I think.
It is. I mean, I love the phrase, I don't remember who said it, that listening is loving. And that's so true. To listen well is to love well.
Mm-hmm. So most of our audience hearing this, I'm sure, is going to want to do a good job of this. We're watching for resources and suggestions to activate our creativity and curiosity. What are some of the resources you would recommend? And feel free, please, to mention, a book like Serving Well, for example, right?
Sure. My wife actually edits a missions website called A Life Overseas that has tons of articles on it now written by missionaries from all over the place. That's a great place to go and search if there's a specific topic you're looking for. Also, if you go to alifeoverseas.com, the sidebar shows the top maybe 10 sort of most viewed articles. And 2 of those articles involve questions that missionary kids would love to be asked, questions that they dread being asked. And I would encourage our listeners to check those 2 articles out.
Mm-hmm.
And they're written for missionary kids, but I looked over them before we started this conversation. They apply to adults too. And they're 2 of the most read articles on the site for a reason, because missionaries have shared them a lot, trying to sort of educate folks in that way. So alifeoverseas.com is a great place. The book that my wife and I wrote came out of a lot of articles, and for my part of the book came out of sitting with missionaries day in, day out at a member care center in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. And the book really is divided up into sections on preparing well, leaving well, sort of loving family well, and then returning well. And so it would be fairly simple for somebody to pick up and just look at it by section for, what does somebody think about this? And we've been really, really blessed and encouraged by folks saying, hey, this speaks what we have felt and gone through as well. So that it's out there among other resources.
Well, our regular listeners know, but we want to mention it again. You can find show notes at globalmissionspodcast.com, and all the links that Jonathan has mentioned here, we will include there, so they'll be easy to find and you can follow up. If a listener would like to reach out to you, Jonathan, and follow up directly with you or maybe Elizabeth, how can they reach out to you?
Yeah, the easiest place is probably our family website, which is www.trotters41.com. It's the numbers 41, 4 and 1. So trotters41.com has got our contact info on it. People can feel free to reach out to me via Facebook as well, either our Trotters for One Facebook page or my page. They just look for my name on Facebook. Be happy to dialogue or link up with further resources and things like that.
Super. Thank you. Well, I like to close with this question usually, and so Jonathan has already heard it once before in a previous episode. If you have the opportunity to stand in front of the missions committee, and the pastor is there as well, these are folks who really want to do a good job of this. And I mean, related to this topic of engaging well with missionaries, talking to missionaries, what would you like to say to that group?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I'm sure I said this first last time, but I think I would start off by saying thank you. Thank you so much. There's no way that missionaries overseas do what they do without the team that is sending. So initially, of course, that is just enormous. And if you're listening to this podcast, you obviously care about doing this well, loving the folks that you've sent very well. So an extra thanks. The other thing that I get from folks all the time when I'm meeting with missionaries is this sort of tension between employee or human being. There's a lot of gray area in here, but I would just really encourage, if I'm standing in front of a missions board, to say, please, 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 try whatever you can to see these people as more than employees producing widgets. It is so tempting. And I think as the Western church continues to be very corporate and maybe grows in the corporate idea and sort of bigger and bigger models, the return on investment becomes more of a discussion. And that can be very demoralizing for missionaries to be talked about or asked questions of or treated as if they are an employee producing widgets. Remember, I know there's a lot of gray area here, but they are human beings who have a whole lot going on and are often living in very challenging places without access to the same resources that folks in the West have and maybe take for granted. Grace upon grace for the humanity of our workers.
It's a good word. Jonathan Trotter, and the book Serving Well has been our topic here today. You can find the book, of course. You can check out the notes with all the links there. Jonathan, always a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you for meeting again with us today and contributing into this. We appreciate having you on the Global Missions Podcast.
Thank you so much. Always a privilege.
Well, that was another great episode. I know when I first saw that this episode was in the plans and saw the title, How to Talk to Missionaries, I really didn't know what to expect. It seemed like it could go in many directions, but I knew that Jonathan would be a great guest, and that proved true. I was definitely helped by his insight and the practical guidance about having these conversations with missionaries, yet it wasn't too prescriptive or too mechanical as he gave advice, and it was just a good, helpful framework. So thanks to Jonathan for this interview today. Megs, as you got to interview Jonathan, what's something that stood out to you from this conversation?
Well, actually, you sort of almost mentioned the highlight that I chose, and it really is, I benefit from having memory hooks in different types of conversations and just a way to go, a framework for it. And I think Jonathan gave us a framework that anyone could use when you're visiting with a missionary worker. And that is to ask, where have you come from? Looking backward through the history of a recent experience. Where are you going? Looking forward. And then finally landing, well, where are you at right now? Which means, how can I pray and interact with you right now? So those memory hooks of where have you been? Where are you going? And how about right now? Very helpful, I think.
Yes, I agree. And he got those questions from the passage in Genesis 16 that he brought our attention to. And something that stood out to me as he explained that passage was that Hagar, in that interaction with the Lord, felt seen. And of course, we know that God fully knows each person. And what a joy and a privilege, as even we have limited extent to know those who are in our lives. We get to emulate God's character to see and know the people that we interact with. And that's something that I think I want to take seriously and find joy in getting to know missionaries and others in my life.
Thank you, Maddie. We look forward to being back again for a conversation in just a couple of weeks. And in the meantime, we hope we might see some of you on Facebook in the Global Missions Toolbox online community.
Yes, we'd love to have you. This podcast is a part of the Global Missions Toolbox, and we hope you'll stop by our website to check out this online collection of resources, especially for senders, pastors, missions committees, and family and friends of workers sent to serve in missions. Join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.